Hello, I'm Professor Janet Thompson Jackson, and this is a class for law students on managing stress during times of uncertainty. I originally designed this class to highlight the ways that law students and lawyers historically have tended to manage stress in ways that are not always healthy and not always life-giving, and to offer some suggestions about how to better manage stresses that are really inherent in law school and in law practice, and if we're honest, really in life. And then coronavirus hit, and everyone began to feel anxiety and uncertainty, and students were and are really struggling with how to handle just even the normal stresses of life in the face of COVID-19. And so even more than normal, it's important to just stop and acknowledge the anxiety and fear that we're feeling, and to collect the tools that we need to be able to get through this time of uncertainty and to be able to manage the everyday stresses that we're going to find ourselves back in the middle of once the virus is contained. That's the goal of this class. Some of you may already have a really good anchor in self-care, or at least a really good hold on to a floaty. If that's not you, if that is you, I hope that by the end of this class, you'll have an even stronger grounding and maybe some new ways of approaching self-care and wellness. Some of you, though, may feel like you're barely treading water, or worse, feel like you're drowning. If that's you, I want to help you to find a surface that will give you some support, a life raft to hold on to during times of uncertainty, tools that you can use on a daily basis or to kind of pull out when you need them. Let's be clear though, no one can magically take away the stress that's all around you. No one can snap their fingers and change uncertainty to certainty for you. All of our lives have been changed by this pandemic, and you may feel worried or angry, or you may be happy about how the government is handling this from the federal level all the way down to the local level. Or maybe your family has a business that's taken a direct hit and you're trying to figure out if you're going to survive it. We're all wondering and concerned about whether this will ultimately mean, or what this ultimately will mean for our country economically. On top of all of those concerns, most of you were plunged into learning how to be educated online for the first time, and you may not be loving that. Your grading system has been changed to credit, no credit. Some of you may be loving that. And if you're a 3L, you've been hit with a commencement ceremony being taken away from you. And as of today, you still don't know what's going to happen with the July bar exam. For some of you, jobs that were certain are now uncertain, or worse, no longer there. Some of you have kids that you're trying to homeschool in the midst of all this. Some of you are just trying to find a quiet place to study. Those are all stressors on top of the normal everyday stressors that you already face. So if you haven't already done this, give yourself a minute to feel your feelings. Acknowledge your feelings, sit there with them for a minute, and that's going to help you to get through them. Even if your feelings are changing by the hour. I get it. 1 minute you're like, I got this. And then a little while later, you're sitting there looking out the window, staring out, full of anxiety. That's normal right now. Let yourself feel that. Give yourself permission to be human. Give yourself permission to be confused. Give yourself permission to be angry. And don't feel guilty if you find yourself feeling happy or relieved that you don't have to leave the house or some other aspect of your new routine. Just acknowledge whatever you're feeling and give yourself permission to be in that space. But if you're in a space that is not a healthy space emotionally, then I urge you to reach out to a professional who can help you. We're going to talk about some tools that can be really helpful, but I want to be clear that those tools don't replace getting professional help if you need it. They can be wonderful supplements to professional help, but they're not replacements. And sometimes you don't even have the words. On the bright side of all this is that when something this big and significant happens, it tends to put the everyday little things into better perspective. And you think, okay, maybe that other thing over there wasn't all that bad. So use this time as a reality check to see what's really important. Notice what's actually rising to the top and what really needs your attention. On a scale of 1 to 10, everything can't be a 10. Actually, everything should never always be a 10, but that's another class and we'll deal with that later. But later in this class, I'm going to invite you to do an exercise that's going to help you to identify those things that really are rising to the top and those things that we just can't even control. At this time, I'd like for you to think of a word for yourself. Your word is a word that describes how you're feeling. Maybe your word describes your hopes and aspirations, your fears and anxieties, your current situation. You don't have to share your word. The only thing I ask is that you are as honest with yourself as possible in choosing a word that really describes where you are right now. No shame, no judgment, just keep it real. So take a minute to write down your word. Okay, you got it? All right, we're going to come back to your word in a little bit, but right now I'm going to take a few minutes to share a bit of my personal story because I've not always been a person who's had a handle on stress and anxiety. And there are a lot of people who can tell you that that's the truth. Anxiety and I used to be pretty good friends. Well, it was more like a bad relationship. I was so used to feeling anxiety inside of me and carrying it with me that it was somehow comforting. For those of you who experience anxiety, you may know what I mean by that. I remember having worrying thoughts as a child, and fast forward to law school, my anxiety ratcheted up a bit. And we're going to see in a few slides how that's really typical for law students. But I did have some atypical stressors in law school. My dad died of cancer when I was a 2L. It was fall semester in October of that year. I was at Howard Law School in Washington, D.C., and I went home to Cleveland, Ohio. I stayed in Cleveland for about 10 days. When I got back to school, the dean of students suggested that I sit out the rest of the semester. Well, I was not hearing that. So she then suggested that I see a therapist on campus. So I made an appointment, and when I showed up to the therapist's office, she put a box of tissues right next to the little couch that I was sitting on. And I remember looking at the tissues and looking back at her, and I just said to her, I'm not even going to need those. I don't have time to cry. And that kind of set the tone for my emotional state for the rest of law school. I put my head down, I studied, I did well, and I didn't grieve. At least I didn't process my grief. After law school, my first job was with a large law firm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was in litigation. I loved the people I worked with, but I found that I really didn't love litigation. I learned a lot, but it just wasn't a good fit for me. At the time, though, I didn't perceive that I had choices. I thought, this is my job. It's a really good job. They're paying me well. Just deal with it. So I did. But I felt very stressed on an almost constant basis. And by the time I was 26 years old, I had an ulcer. So I finally did start seeing a therapist to help manage my stress. And that's actually when the floodgates opened and I processed my grief for the first time with my dad's passing. And it was a hard time, I'll admit that, because I had been coping in ways that the statistics now show that many law students use as coping mechanisms and new lawyers as well. Occasionally I drank too much. I developed an eating disorder. And looking back, I was just grasping at ways to manage this constant feeling of overwhelm. And I think I was looking for ways to not process my grief, just stuffing down the feelings, stuffing them down. but therapy helped. So for those of you who are in therapy, I would say stick with it, with a therapist that you trust and you feel is helping you to move forward. If you feel that you could benefit from therapy, I strongly encourage that you take that step. I'll say that it does take a big commitment, a commitment not just of your time, but to do some deep work, but it really can be a wonderful and really effective path to freedom from your anxiety, from your depression, from your OCD, from whatever it is you're dealing with. So after 3 years at my first law firm, I moved back to the Washington, D.C. area and joined a smaller firm because by then I was into my self-care journey at the beginning of it, I think, and I thought that that change would be helpful for me. And it was in many ways. I practiced at my second firm for about 3 years, almost 3 years. And again, I really enjoyed the people that I worked with, and I even met one of my closest friends there, but I didn't particularly connect with the work. So long story short, I shifted my career and became an executive director of a nonprofit organization in DC that helps homeless and housing insecure families. It was really fulfilling work, and it was also during that span of time that two things happened. One, I started teaching law school as an adjunct, and I found that I loved it. And the second thing is that I started heavily researching and practicing self-care. And I came to understand something that I mentioned earlier, how that anxiety that you carry with you can almost be comforting when you have it so long. Well, what I learned is that there's a really close connection between anxiety and the illusion of control. Worrying and being anxious somehow made me feel like I was being productive. If I was anxious, I was on top of things. I told myself that my anxiety kind of gave me an edge. And I think that that's one reason why high-performing people, including law students, have a hard time adopting self-care practices. They see their anxiety as an edge, as a benefit somehow. And what I will say to those people is that when you're finally able to let go of that grip of fear and anxiety that you think you need, or those negative thoughts that are reeling through your mind on repeat, that's when you actually find the freedom to be your best self, to just be your best. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that I never get anxious anymore. I'd be lying if I said that. I'm sure right now my family, in the midst of coronavirus, is saying, if she asked me to wash my hands for 20 seconds one more time. So my thing is germs. That's a trigger for me. That's one of my anxiety triggers. So living in the age of COVID-19 has been interesting. But I had to make a choice. I was either going to let this throw me off base, or I was going to use this as an opportunity to practice my self-care tools, actually to take them to another level and to maintain my equilibrium. And my tools, including my support system, have helped me to keep a really good perspective most of the time. So we're going to get to those tools in a little bit because I want you to get to a place of knowing how to manage your stress and anxiety a whole lot faster than I did. Stress is going to be there at school, at work, at home, in life. It's about having the tools to cope in a healthy way so that you can do more than get through law school and life, but you can actually thrive. And that's what I want for you. I want you to thrive. I also want you to be educated about what the landscape has been for law students and lawyers in the areas of mental health and alcohol and substance abuse. You're about to see a bunch of statistics that are quite sobering, no pun intended. If any of this looks familiar to you because you are currently in that space, I want you to do two things. One, I want you to be compassionate with yourself. And 2, I want you to reach out to someone for help. If none of this personally resonates with you, then I'm going to ask you to keep a couple of things in mind. 1, the data show that a number of your classmates are struggling with one or more of these issues. So I hope that you choose to be compassionate with them and be a support in any way that you can. And if you don't know how you can be supportive, then there are people who can help you figure that out. All right, now some statistics. And most of these are from 2016 and 2014 studies. So unfortunately, I think that we can expect the numbers to go up as a result of this pandemic. We know that law students experience anxiety and depression at levels significantly higher than that experienced in the general public. And again, that's without the presence of coronavirus. This virus has changed the way we interact, and even more importantly, for some people, it's taken away our normal routines. For some people, that may not be a big deal, but for people who live with severe anxiety, and especially people who live with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, the sudden removal of a routine can be traumatic. I mentioned earlier that it's typical for law students to experience stress at high levels, and we see here that after entering law school, mental health challenges increase by 20 to 40%, so that's pretty significant. Your anxiety may manifest itself in law school, but it doesn't end there. For some of you, it will follow you into practice and onto the bench if you become a judge one day. Here are some more statistics for practicing lawyers. And one of the reasons that it's so important to understand these issues now and this landscape now is because most lawyers face these problems in the first 10 years of practice. Not only are anxiety and depression high among law students and lawyers, but the incidence of suicide is high in the legal profession. I just want to pause here and speak to anyone who during this time of sheltering at home and isolation is struggling with depression and thoughts of hurting yourself. If that is you, please reach out to someone for help. There are many people that you can reach out to: a suicide hotline, a friend, a teacher, a neighbor. If that's not you, but you know someone who's struggling and who may harm themselves, please reach out to that person and help them to get the help that they need. This next slide deals with eating disorders, and I include this information because it's an area that is often overlooked. And it's not just impacting the female gender, it really is people who identify across the gender spectrum are experiencing eating disorders, probably in higher numbers than is reported. How people cope with stress through their relationship with food isn't always an obvious problem. Some people may look perfectly fine, but they are binging and purging, or they're exercising excessively, or not eating real food, or maybe they have an addiction to sugar or salt or fat, or something that they just can't seem to control. Whatever form it takes, it can become a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, the statistics on this slide may not be surprising to some people. Law students and lawyers have always had a reputation for drinking, but these numbers help tell the story. This next slide highlights some of the differences between problem drinking and hazardous drinking. Problem drinking is defined as having an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, but one that does not rise to the level of alcoholism. Hazardous drinking, on the other hand, includes alcoholism or alcohol abuse. The demographics tell us that the problem drinker will most likely be male. most likely within his first 10 years of practice, and typically works at a firm or at a bar association. That one was a bit surprising. Next, some law students reported abusing prescription drugs. What do you think were the reasons for that abuse? Do any of these reasons surprise you? Now, next, here are the drugs that are used most by lawyers. It used to be that doctors and dentists were at the top of the list for prescription and non-prescription drug abuse. But now lawyers have caught up and in some cases have surpassed them. Okay, let's talk about getting help and what stops law students and lawyers from getting help. What are the barriers? What do you think are the top barriers reported for getting help for alcohol abuse and drug use? Now let's move on to mental health challenges. As you can see, with these reasons for these barriers, there's similar reasons in both areas, but different percentages. But all of the respondents listed potential threat to bar admission as a barrier to seeking help. That's a problem that's been a topic of discussion in many jurisdictions. And fortunately, some jurisdictions have listened and have or are responding to the position that law students find themselves in. Many students feel, and this has turned out to be true in some cases, that if they honestly answer questions about mental health in particular, that they may not be admitted to the bar to practice. Even if that wasn't a consequence of answering honestly, no one should be made to feel that the better choice is to hide their mental illness or their mental health status, especially when a person's mental health is well managed and would have no negative impact on a person's ability to practice law. And that's the case with the vast majority of lawyers. What are some resources? Well, there's KLAP. That's an excellent resource, the Kansas Lawyers Assistance Program. There's a lawyers assistance program in every jurisdiction. Very helpful. It's confidential, so students can go without fear of other people finding out. They can help with alcohol abuse, substance abuse, mental health issues. They're there to be a support, and it's really a wonderful resource. And there are actually students who have been through KLAP who are willing to talk to other students. So please check that out as a resource. What are some other resources? Well, on Washburn's campus, the counseling service, the dean of students, your professors, your mentors, your peers. These people can be reached even in the midst of coronavirus. Just reach out if you need someone. Someone will be there to help you. So maybe none of that describes you. Maybe you don't have anxiety or OCD or an eating disorder. Maybe you don't drink too much, you don't use drugs. If that is the case for you, then that is something to be truly grateful for. But none of us is immune to stress. So these are tools, these tools that we're going to talk about are tools that are going to be helpful in any situation, just generally in life. But first, it's really important to give yourself a break. You are human. You're going to make mistakes. Some days you're going to feel like you're drowning. Some days you're going to feel like you're killing it. Your emotions may change by the hour, they may change by the minute. Don't beat yourself up. Really grant yourself some compassion, some grace during this time. You know, if this is a time where you just can't stick to that exercise program or that diet or whatever it is that you decided at the beginning of the year was going to be your thing to stick to, it's okay. Give yourself a break. Just back off. Lower those expectations a little bit right now because there's a lot to handle. There's a lot to handle. And use your tools. And so we're going to talk about these tools. I call these 12 daily rituals. They're really suggestions, and it doesn't mean that you have to adopt all 12 of them or do them daily or do any of them at all. You can experiment with them and see what works best for you. And add your own to the list. You may have things that work very well for you. So let's take a look at them. Number one, get centered at the beginning of the day. If you can, at least on most days, try not to start your day by grabbing your phone and looking at the news feed or even your Facebook feed or other social media feed. It would be great just to be able to start your day in a way that centers you. That could mean just looking at the sunrise, or it could mean just focusing on your breathing, reading something uplifting, just kind of being present for yourself in the morning to start your day. If you haven't already created a routine, a new routine with the sheltering at home, this is a great time to do that and to embrace it. You might have to grieve your old routine a bit, but embrace a new routine and kind of incorporate that into your day, into your life. Move. And a lot of times, you can find something to do at home, even if you have to do something in place, or there's so many videos that you can pull up or download and do something, but get moving. You'll just feel better. Read something uplifting. There's so much scary news out there, and it's impossible not to kind of get caught up in the news feed of all of this alarming information and all of the uncertainty that is being communicated out there. Put that down sometimes and just read something that's funny or uplifting, make yourself laugh, just something light, or read something that's light. Be kind. This is a great time just to practice kindness. Someone needs your kindness, even someone that you can't physically see and be close to. There are so many ways of reaching out and still extending kindness to people. Stay connected. There are some people for whom this sheltering at home is really difficult. And I'm thinking particularly of the extroverts who really need the social interaction, and even some people who aren't that extroverted, just are used to social interaction. And being away from classmates and being able to bump into people in the hallways, it's really hard for some people and harder for some than others. So reach out to those people and maybe send them a text, do a video chat or something just to stay connected. And breathe. And I'm not just talking about your just regular breathing. Let's actually try this now. Take a moment to just take a deep breath in through your nose. Just feel that breath go from your tummy all the way to your chest. And then just pause for a moment and let it out slowly through your mouth. Just a slow release. And as you're releasing that breath, imagine yourself releasing something that you don't need. Some worry, some concern, something that you've been holding. Just release anything that's not serving you. Maybe do that a couple of more times, a deep breath in. Just hold it for a moment, and then just release through the mouth and let something go. Just let something go. A lot of times I will do that. By the third time, I can feel my entire body starting to relax. So it's a really good exercise, and you can do it anytime. Okay, the next one is eating mindfully. This is a good one, but for right now, I'm not mad at you if you're reaching for the chocolate and you're not trying to eat mindfully. That's okay. But when you get a chance to try and be more mindful, this is a really good practice, and I really highly recommend it. Maybe one meal a day where you lose all your distractions and you're just eating and really paying attention to your food. This is the exercise I talked about earlier, this review and release. And the exercise is basically to identify things that are on your mind that you kind of need to release. So let's do this now. Why don't you grab that piece of paper and a pen again and write down all of the things that you're worried about, or all of the things that are causing that knot in your stomach that you're thinking about. Things that are just occupying space in your mind, even if you're not categorizing them as a worry or a concern, but things that you're just thinking a lot about right now. Go ahead and write those things down. Could be just a few things. It could be more time than we have right now to fill your list. It could be pages. Just write down a few of them right now. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to think about that and to write. For most people, there's a lot there. Okay, there may be more, and you can continue that list and write them all down later. And you might have something small like, I'm tired of fixing peas for dinner every night, but that's all I have in the freezer for vegetables. Or it could be something like, is it safe to walk outside? And just have a lot of anxiety about that. It could be, am I going to have a job when I get out of law school? It could be anything from the things that we would consider minor to things that are just huge, that are really, really weighing us down. The goal is for the list to not only identify what's occupying your thoughts and what needs your, or what may need your immediate attention, but also to help you identify what you have control over and what you may need to release. So now that you have your list, circle those things that you have no control over that are on your list. And I'm guessing that there are one or two things that you've written down that are occupying your thoughts that you really just don't have any control over, or you have very little control over. Those are the things that you can work on releasing in order to make space for those things that were not circled, those things that may need your mental and physical energy to actually address. So it's good just to be able to separate them and know what you may need to put aside. And it may take some work to do that, and that's okay. But at least you've kind of identified those things. Okay. Let's move on to the next thing on the list. Unplug. So my suggestion is to try to unplug an hour before you go to bed. Most people these days are spending more time plugged into a device than sleeping. So that's not necessarily good. If it seems like too much to ask to unplug an hour before, then try 15 minutes before unplugging. Try looking at a screen not the last thing you do before you close your eyes to go to sleep. Just to give your brain a break, to give your eyes a break, to give your mind a break, and just to, again, kind of settle down and to have a transition. It's really helpful. Express gratitude. This does not mean that you have to keep a gratitude journal necessarily. It's a great practice if you want to do that. But studies show that expressing gratitude for one thing every day helps to create a shift in our perspective and makes us happier. So if you can just think of one thing every day that you're grateful for, it could be the sunrise, it could be sleeping in, it could be a good meal, it could be being able to pet your dog, your cat, anything that you think, that was good. If you can write it down, that's even better, because sometimes we're in a space where we need to be able to be reminded of what we're grateful for. So if you can write it down, that's great. And then just getting enough restorative sleep. Law students, students generally don't get as much sleep as they should, and that's understandable. We give you a whole lot of work to do, so sleeping is kind of at a premium, but try to catch up when you can. Try to take a nap or to just get some extra sleep in, to get some restorative sleep. And during a time of a lot of uncertainty and high anxiety, it's really important to get that sleep. So the next tool that I want to talk about is something that I created to help myself. And I call it high frequency thinking. I don't know about you, but I sometimes get in a loop of thoughts that are not always rational, and they can sometimes be really fearful thoughts. I call them stories that are going on in my head, because sometimes it's really just in my head. Part of my own self-care was coming up with some kind of method that would kind of walk me off of the cliff, back me off of that cliff of thoughts. So I created this, again, that I call high frequency thinking, and it involves a method of examining my thought, reframing it, and then replacing it with a more constructive thought. And that really helps me to get out of this loop. So let me kind of explain with an example how this works. Okay, my thought. Well, I have an easy example. My thought this time recently was associated with this class that I'm giving right now. This wellness talk, I thought this is not going to go well because it was originally not planned for an online platform. So this is just not going to go well. It's not going to be what I want it to be. That was my thought. I probably thought this is going to be a disaster, but it's not going to go well. I usually get this class in person. I'm kind of able to read the room. I'm able to read the energy in the room. So I had all of these things going through, these stories, the story going through my head as to why this class is not going to turn out well. And then I thought, okay, well, what do I know? It's part of my examining. What do I know? Well, what I know is that because of the circumstances, I worked really hard to put something together on an online platform that I thought, that I hoped would reach people. And so I know all of the research that I did and the effort I put in to creating something that would work online. And I know of the intention that I have brought to this. That's what I know. So my thought was, this isn't going to work. This is going to be a disaster. That was my fearful conclusion based on nothing but fear. And as is often the case, my fear did not take into account the facts that I had before me, what I actually know, and that is what I was putting into this. So the next thing I do is to reframe. And I ask myself a couple of questions. The first is, what was my thought feeding me? Or what was it feeding in me? And this is really important to see where this mindset is coming from. So once I thought about it, I realized that my fearful thought came from my desire to be in complete control of every aspect of my class. Because who doesn't want to be, right? Our need to control often manifests itself in a lot of different ways that are anxiety driven. For me, it was, this isn't going to work because this is not how I originally planned it. And there's this big unknown out there of whether people are even going to receive this. And even if I am going to know that people receive it. So that was the mindset. I want to be able to control this. So I'm recognizing that I've got this control thing going on. What is that thought costing me? Well, it was costing me my peace of mind. It was costing me my equilibrium at a time when I really wanted to be in a good space. Because originally I did this class as a live class for my clinic students on Zoom. And it was really important for me to show up in a way that was going to be helpful for them. So that's what it was costing me. And the last part of that reframe is, what is my reward for releasing my thought? Now that answer usually is the exact opposite of what it's costing you, but it's helpful to kind of work through it anyway. So the reward for me was to be able to enter into my class knowing that I had done everything I could do to make it as useful and helpful as possible, and that I could let it go. My reward really was the release, was instead of holding tight, trying to control things that I really didn't have any control over outside of my preparation, to be able to release it. So then the next part of this method is to replace. So I always ask myself, what is my truth? And frequently, I put that truth in the form of an affirmation. So on that day, as soon as I released needing to control this, a Bob Marley song popped in my head. And it's that song, Three Little Birds. And the line was, every little thing is going to be all right. That was my truth. That was my affirmation. That was my mantra. And it actually was. So I use this method so much now that I can sometimes go from what is my thought to what is my truth. But there's a lot of value in going through the entire process to help you understand, to help me understand what my mindset is and what I need to release. So that's something helpful. There's some other tools that I use. Meditation is one. I like using different types of meditation. One that I'm a real fan of is one that's listed here, and that is a loving kindness meditation, where you start with yourself and you go through thoughts of loving kindness for yourself. And then you think of someone who you're close to, and you hold that person in your mind and in your thoughts. And then you extend that to a person who maybe you don't know very well. Maybe it's the person, the cashier at the grocery store who's on the front lines, or someone else who you've seen who's helpful, or even someone you've seen on television or on a video or something. You hold that person in those loving thoughts that are listed there, and you go through, may you be well, may you have loving kindness. And then the next stage is to go to someone who you may have some conflict with. Now, I suggest that you start slowly, not necessarily someone with whom you've had this big, horrible relationship with for years. Maybe someone you have just a little bit of a rift with, or someone who you've had an argument with, and hold that person in your mind's eye and go through the loving kindness meditation. And then extend it out to the world. May we all be well. May we all be filled with loving kindness. And go through that. And the idea is to hold, starting with yourself and going outward, everyone in your heart. And I find it very difficult to get through that and not to have a really positive, compassionate feeling by the end of it. And it's a wonderful thing. Sometimes I go to sleep to it, so it's great. How does meditation and mindfulness help? And there are a lot of ways that you see here that it's actually helpful to us. And one of the ways that may be surprising is helping with implicit bias. But if you think about it, if you're doing things to be more mindful and compassionate, and kind of seeing yourself as not separate from everyone else, because meditation helps us to see that we're connected, we're all connected, then it makes sense that your biases could be eliminated, or at least lowered. And then other ways that meditation and mindfulness help: supporting alcohol and substance abuse treatment. Again, not necessarily a substitute for treatment, but really supportive. And the one that I love, or two, compassion. You can be more compassionate and a happier person. It's worth it just for that. We've also found that meditation and mindfulness creates greater ethical behavior. So in terms of professionalism, there are just so many benefits to being more mindful and to practicing meditation. All right, now it's time to create your own wellness plan. I want you to get out the piece of paper again, hopefully another piece of paper and a pen, and I want you to take a few minutes, maybe I'll just give you a minute, to write down three things that you'll do starting today for your own self-care. What are you going to incorporate? It could be one of the many things that we've talked about, one of the 12 daily rituals. It could be a number of things. What are you going to do? 3 things that you're going to commit to for your own self-care. Go. If you feel like you can't commit to 3, at least put 1 or 2 things down. Start somewhere. Okay. And you can always go back to that. But now I want to go back to choosing a word. I'm going to tell you what my word was. My word is hope. I'm a hopeful person, and I'm really happy to realize that the coronavirus pandemic has not changed that. In the midst of this, I'm still hopeful. That doesn't mean that I haven't been frightened by this. It doesn't mean that I haven't been sad or angry, because I have felt all of those things and more. But I always seem to be landing back at a place of hope. I'm hopeful for our country. I'm hopeful for our world. And I'm especially hopeful for you as students. So what was your word? If you care to share it with me or to talk about any of this, please send me an email. You're going to get my email address at the end. I would love to talk to you. I wanted to share this quote from Viktor Frankl, which I think is very apropos at this time. And I also wanted to include some meditation links for you in case you want to look for some guided meditation. I'm also going to be recording some of my own short guided meditations that I will make available to you. And here's my email. So again, please be in touch. I'd love to hear from you. So that's it for this class. Thank you for listening. My hope for all of you is that you're not just able to get through this, but that you're able to thrive in the midst of it and to continue to thrive after this pandemic is over. I hope that you pick up some tools, that you keep them close at hand, and that you use them, including calling in your support community. Any support that's out there for you, including myself and so many other people. Thank you, and be well.